Welcome to the Bible Made Clear. As we are going through this series on understanding our adversary, we have come to number 6, which is Satan is a perverter. So he perverts the truth. It's pretty simple. But let's walk through some of what he does. Now, what Pentecost does in his book is he uses these 6 woes in Isaiah 5, which I think is a great idea. And so I'll follow the same pattern, though I'll make some different observations than he did. So we have basically the 6 woes. And after Isaiah had talked about how God had expected fruit from the vine, meaning Israel, at the beginning of Isaiah chapter 5, because they did not bring forth fruit under the Mosaic law, then he says this in verse 8, "Woe to those who join house to house. They add field to field till there is no place where they may dwell alone in the midst of the land. In my hearing, the Lord of hosts said," or Jehovah of hosts is what it's saying with the caps there, "Truly many houses shall be desolate, great and beautiful ones without inhabitant. For 10 acres of vineyard shall yield 1 bath, and a homer of seed shall yield 1 ephah," which is not a lot. Verse 11, "Woe to those who rise early in the morning, that they may follow intoxicating drink, who continue until night, till wine inflames them. The harp and the strings, the tambourine and flute, and wine are in their feasts." They get music, food, and dancing, right? "But they do not regard the work of the Lord, nor consider the operation of his hands. Therefore my people have gone into captivity because they have no knowledge. Their honorable men are famished, and their multitude dried up with thirst. Therefore Sheol," talking about the grave, the life beyond this, "has enlarged herself and opened its mouth beyond measure. Their glory and their multitude and their pomp, and he who is jubilant, shall descend into it. People shall be brought down, each man shall be humbled, and the eyes of the lofty shall be humbled. But the Lord, Jehovah of hosts," or Yahweh of armies if you want, "shall be exalted in judgment, and God who is holy shall be hallowed in righteousness. Then the lambs shall feed in their pasture, and in the waste places of the fat ones strangers shall eat." And now the third woe, verse 18, "Woe to those who draw iniquity with cords of vanity, and sin as if with a cart rope, that say," quote, "Let him make speed and hasten his work that we may see it, and let the counsel of the Holy One of Israel draw near and come that we may know it." Not a good challenge to God, end of quote. And the next one, verse 20, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter." And then verse 21, "Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight." Now these last two actually combine together. Verse 22, "Woe to men mighty at drinking wine, woe to men valiant for mixing intoxicating drink." That's really one woe. "Who justify the wicked for a bribe," that's what they end up doing because they're drinking, "and take away justice from the righteous man." So obviously in the context here, the woes are going to come upon Israel because Israel is sinning against the covenant that they're under through the Mosaic law. And because of that, God is going to judge them. Now, Babylon came down as well as Assyria to bring judgment to Israel. So this is dealing with those judgments and the results of them. So let's break down the woes. Let's take a quick look at it. The first woe is against monopoly and greed, right? Verses 8 to 10. And it describes the perversion of owning land or owning property into the greed of being unsatisfied until all is owned. They don't want just some property. They want everything. And it's always at the expense of the poor, the people who really have no leverage against them. The consequences are a lack of productivity and loss. Satan perverts all that God gives for the needs and contentment in life. One of the things that Satan does to pervert, first of all, he perverts everything. Everything that God has given for good and for benefit, Satan will twist around and pervert in some way to be used for evil and wickedness. There's no reason for these people to be taking advantage of the poor. If you go into the book of Micah and read through it, in chapter 2, it talks about how the people in leadership, and this was Judah, this was the southern kingdom that Micah was talking to, they couldn't even go to bed at night until they knew that they had figured out a way to steal more land, which is really the inheritance of families, from the people that were struggling. They took advantage of all those things, and God was angry at them. I mean, they sold the poor, it says, Micah tells us, for a pair of shoes. So they'd ruin somebody's life, take their last piece of inheritance just to buy some clothing. It was awful, and God remembers that, because he takes up the cause of the poor and the needy, and there's no reason for their greed here. God has given them land, he's given them plenty, but they just, out of their greed, they wanted more and more. They're unsatisfied with what they had. So what God gave them for contentment, Satan twisted it around, perverted it, and got them to go after it in a sinful way. The BBC, the Believer's Bible Commentary, says this: covetous landowners who try to corner the real estate market till there is an acute shortage of houses and land, yet the owners dwell in a solitary splendor. The captivity will leave many houses empty, and the land will yield only fractional harvests. This will be the Babylonian captivity. The grapevines growing on 5 acres of land will yield only 5 gallons of wine. 10 bushels of seed will produce only 1 bushel of grain. So almost nothing will come out of what they're trying to harvest. And that's where the judgment of God comes in. The second woe is against degeneracy, verses 11 through 17. And it described the misuse of God's benefits and kindness. The key verse is the second part of verse 12, where it says, "But they do not regard the work of the Lord," or Jehovah, "nor consider the operation of his hands." So again, Satan perverts God's blessings. Again, the BBC says this: confirmed alcoholics who imbibe from morning until night. In other words, they're always drinking and partying. They feast and carouse in total disregard of God and his works. It is for this kind of unthinking behavior that the exile is drawing near. The honorable men and the multitude will suffer famine, then death. No class will escape humiliation. It's amazing to me that, the elites, even in our own country, when they're in power, they think if they can destroy the country, and whoever it is that takes over in this kind of, Marxist viewpoint of government and society, that somehow, they'll be the privileged ones that escape being the proletariats, the regular class that just do all the work like slaves, and everybody lives in a kind of a communistic environment. And as Marx would say, sure, everybody would be happy. It'll be a utopia because nobody will have anything. So you won't want what your neighbor has, like you do in capitalism. You won't want what your neighbor has because they won't have anything. They won't have anything different than you. No food difference, no clothing difference, no housing difference, nothing. So everybody will basically have nothing, and they'll all be thrilled with it. This is by a guy that married a wealthy woman that didn't work a day in his life and just wrote on stuff. I mean, a philosophy from a guy that had no idea what real life was about and was just a miserable, frustrated loser. That's how I see Karl Marx anyways. But anyways, the last sentence here, it says, "But God will be vindicated by his righteous judgment when foreign Bedouin shepherds feed their flocks in the ruins of Israel." It's unfortunate because it doesn't need to be, right? A.W. Tozer said this. I just happened to be reading this when I was putting these quotes together. "We often treat Jesus the way Saul treated David. We want him to slay giants and sing evil spirits away, but we don't want him to be king." And I think, though in the text it's talking about Israel's leaders who were essentially, alcoholics that were just interested in, their alcohol and their getting their buzz on and forgetting about reality and doing what they want and, getting paid their bribes so they can continue to do it and everything. We need to be careful as Christians that we don't treat Jesus the way Saul treated David. And, we want him for the good, but as soon as the difficulty comes, we're really not in it for that. We only want the good times. We want to be positive, and we want to be so positive that, reality starts to float away. There's nothing wrong with being positive. We want to be positive and encouraging and all that, but there's just a reality to the fact that not everything is positive, and even in the Christian life, things are not going to always work out positively, and no matter how much of a positive attitude you may have, the reality is that reality hits, and pretending it's not as it is puts you more into a hallucinogenic state where you're really kind of hypnotizing yourself to think that things are different than they are. We need to lean on the promises of God, absolutely. But the promises of God many times are based on difficulty that people are actually in. Not that they avoid thinking that they're in, but realize they are in them. The weakness of positive confession, as it's been, as the church has been poisoned by this, is that people are made to confess things positively because they're in fear of the negative. And not only can you not control reality by just speaking certain words, okay, which any sane person should realize that. And the Bible gives us the same indication. Jesus said many negative things, to which, if there was a positive confession adherent within his midst at the time, would have said, you shouldn't say such things. Those are very negative. But when God says something, it's true, regardless of the situation that it's in. So it's important to understand that just saying things that are positive is missing the point, because there's a lack of distinction when you think that just saying positive things will kind of self-encourage you and everything else. That's actually a weaker faith or no faith because you're leaning on something that you are producing. What we need to actually lean on and make a distinction in is the promises of God that can be applied to our situation in life. Once we have a good understanding of what the Bible teaches and we can apply those promises to whatever situation that we are in. Then what we are doing is we are leaning on God's word and not just on positive confession or thinking or visualization and all that like pop psychology nonsense, because that will eventually collapse, and then the people that are the adherents become extremely disillusioned, many times disillusioned with God himself. So it's important that we understand, like, as Christians, that we're living in reality. Like, we need to understand that what we do is going to have an effect in our lives, but it's not just a positive and negative thing. It's either adding to our spiritual life or taking away from it. Or as Paul the Apostle says in Galatians 6, if we're sowing to the flesh, we're going to reap corruption. If we sow to the Spirit, we reap eternal life. Not to earn eternal life, but we're reaping the benefits and the natural consequences of basically walking and maturing in our faith. Or as Jesus said, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, right? Matthew 6:33. And all these things, all the things that he was talking about. He's talking about material stuff. Food, clothing, roof over your head and all that. He said all those things, they'll all be added to you. In other words, you let God worry about those. You worry about doing what God wants. In other words, you worry about God's concerns and he'll take care of your concerns. The other way around, it's trying to repeat the right words so that we address our own concerns all the time. It's really a subtle difference, but it's a dangerous one. So anyways, moving on, Tozer speaks of a problem then in the nation of Israel with their sinful living with David and Saul, and a problem now in the lives of many Christians. Obviously, we don't want to just have Jesus as the one that serves the good time, is the point. The third woe is against unbelief, no fear of God. Verses 18 and 19 describe a people who are so bound to sin they need to use a cart rope, which is stronger than a regular rope. The word picture is someone bound to a cart that has to pull their sin along, and it's amazing word picture. Like, they get so much sin, they have to have a strong rope to drag it along. Satan perverts the threat of God's judgment as a joke through unbelief. And so if God promises judgment, these people are practicing positive confession. They're ignoring it, and they just want to think of the nice things. Well, the reality is it was coming. They can think as many positive thoughts and nice things and sentiments as they want, but the reality is it was coming. And Satan had deceived them into just being convinced of a positive confession. The College Press commentary says this: not having faith in God, they sin openly as those who draw or pull after them a load of sin with cords or ropes. They're so enslaved to their sins and to Satan, they are like harnessed oxen who pull heavy burdens. The difference being men voluntarily wish it to be so, while animals have no choice. And we call animals dumb, and far from being penitent, they are brazen. When told of God's coming judgment, instead of fleeing to hide in the rocks, they scoff. What is God waiting for? Tell him to come on. We would like to see him come in judgment. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Absence of the fear of the Lord leads to stupidity. Great comment. They hit the nail on the head with that right there. The fourth woe is against moral confusion. Verse 20 describes the result of unbelief, which is moral confusion. The value reversal moved from moral relativism to moral anarchy. So relativism, because it has no anchor, moral relativism, the natural end of that is anarchy. Satan perverts morality into anarchy, in other words, until it gets to that point, because there's no more anchors. Nobody knows what's right and wrong, and people just do whatever they want, and things become just chaotic in society, and it's a non-functional society. I mean, we've seen that in different cities around the United States. So again, the college press says this: where there is no faith in God, there are no clear-cut moral distinctions, no clear conception of what is right and wrong. There can be only moral relativism. A thing is right because we want it to be. Moral anarchy. When unbelief takes over, all values are turned upside down. What is good is said to be bad. What is bad is said to be good. Where this reversal of values occurs, cowardice becomes caution, recklessness becomes courage, stinginess becomes thrift, extravagance in expenditure becomes generosity, sin becomes maladjustment, right or wrong becomes a matter of custom. There appear as many ethical standards as there are individuals, because basically it's a person's opinion as opposed to a moral standard, something objectively outside of them that transcends them and is based in God. People make up their own laws to suit their own purposes. My gosh, come to Massachusetts. You'll see that. Recognition of authority, except for oneself, disappears. You'll see that within our own legislature. Here we had 72% of the people in the last election vote to audit the legislature. The legislature is the only body of, only political body in the state that is not audited. Nobody knows what they do with money. They do whatever they want. They are unaccountable other than to themselves. And so 72% of the people said, we want them audited. So we all voted for it. And you know how many audits have been done since then? You guessed it, none, because they said, no, that's not going to happen. So they went to the Attorney General, but because she is really running interference for the legislature and probably the governor, she's just delaying and won't help the auditor. So the auditor had to go out and get an independent legal firm in order to sue to try to do her job. So she's spending tax dollars to have to do the job that we all voted for her to do. So basically, Massachusetts it does not run in a democratic way, right? Because when politicians go against the will of the people, that moves towards just a dictatorship or a Marxist type government. I mean, that's what Marxists do. They have these authoritarian rulers come in. They do exactly what they want, no matter what the people vote for, ask for, appeal for, or anything else. They just say, I'm going to do what I'm going to do, and I'm going to do it the way I want to do it, and you have no say. Welcome to Massachusetts. But anyways, the last couple of sentences in yellow. It says, society soon resembles a chicken with its head cut off. No coordination, no purpose, no control. Moral anarchy results in civil and social destruction and death. And that's what was happening in Israel, and unfortunately we see that in many blue states, even in our own country. The fifth woe is against conceit, right? Pride and arrogance. Verse 21 describes people who are impressed with themselves and their position. They believe their own press reports and typically write them, which is interesting. Satan perverts normal, healthy self-confidence into artificial, self-interested conceit. It's fake, right? So College Press, they had some good comments on this. It says, not only do they sin blatantly, is in previous, right? They take pride in their adeptness in sinning. They are wise in their own eyes. The farther men drift from God in unbelief, the more conceited they become. And you get some references there if you want to look them up. God becomes something to set on a table as a kind of ornament. Religion becomes a fetish, having no real place, no real function in life. The real issues and problems of society are made relative to selfish interests. Pride is the snare of the devil. Pride brought the judgment of God upon angels. And pride's going to bring judgment on people. It's interesting that they say religion becomes a fetish, having no real place, because that's exactly what, they try to do through a lot of these blue state governments regarding Christianity. You will always have oppression of Christianity in places like Massachusetts and other states because they remove the rights that people have in making decisions for themselves and their families because they are authoritarian. And, they just love totalitarian type governmental systems. They say one thing, but they actually, bring to bear the other. So, it's easy to know whether politicians are telling the truth. It doesn't really matter what they say, it's what they do. You watch what they do. Now, if you see what they do in their policies and their practices, and then move back to see what they say, you'll find out many blue state politicians, and this isn't a political issue, this is a moral issue that we're talking about here, okay? Many blue state politicians will say the very opposite of what they're doing, and they'll accuse their opponents of the very thing that they're practicing. You go into more red states and you look at more conservative politicians, not all of them. Hey, they're not all choir boys. I know that. But, the bottom line is that if you can actually have a politician follow through on what they said that they would do, regardless of whether you like their personality or not, then that means they're true to their word. If you have people that just say the opposite, they'll say what people want to hear, but then their practices and their policies are opposite that. They're just lying. I mean, this isn't rocket science. I mean, certainly the mainstream media won't, talk about any of this because they actually want to protect the people that are lying. But it is what it is. That's getting into things outside of this. But the parallel is really unmistakable if you look at it. The sixth woe is against the perversion of justice. It kind of goes with everything we're saying, right? You can see it easily in the political realm. Now, what we're talking about here is we're talking about Israel's leaders. They are the political and spiritual leaders. Now, in Israel, you had the kings and the princes. They were their civil leaders. You had the priests. They were the spiritual leaders. They were the Bible teachers. They were supposed to teach people the law. That was their job, okay? Then you have the prophets. The prophets were the moral leaders. They were the ones that would hear from God based on a situation and kind of try to kick people back into being obedient morally to the law. So whether you have civil, spiritual, or moral leaders, each one had their role. Now, in our society, the civil leaders that are supposed to abide by the Constitution are the politicians. They're supposed to abide by the Constitution, and then as the spiritual leaders in society should be teaching people to obey the Constitution. Now, we, as pastors, we certainly teach people to obey the Bible, but there's nothing in the Constitution that's unbiblical. As a matter of fact, much of it's taken from Old and New Testament, if not in wording, at least in principle and thought. And as you look at it, you realize that the things that normal Christian churches, ones that follow the Bible, tell their people to do is to obey the law, the civil law that we live under in the country, and to obey God, right? Because God is saying the authorities are put there by Him. Now, the problem comes when you have spiritual authorities within different religious groups that say not to obey the law. So if you have people coming out that are against the Constitution, which makes up our way of life in this country, and basically trying to undermine the government, well, that's a problem. So, and there are religious groups that do that, so you can apply that one pretty easily on your own. College Press says this: selfishness is the first step into degradation. Selfishness means dethronement of God. As a result of such dethronement, men turn to false securities, false gods. Wine, sex, money, all are sought as replacements for God. The leaders of Judah became sots, alcoholics. Sots is an old term for it. Drunkards administered the government. In America, we have drunken legislators, and again, I didn't write this. This is like in the 1960s by the original College Press commentators. Drunken government executives and drunken military leaders administering our government. Drunkenness, graft, bribery, injustice, corruption of all kinds were rampant in Judah at this time. The justification for such action was cynical unbelief. One important issue of such living is moral anarchy. The inevitable consequence of such a society is arrogant rulers and an oppressed populace, meaning us. The leaders of the country boasted and prided themselves not in how well they ruled, but in how well they mixed drinks and how drunken they were able to become. So again, we, at least in my opinion, have a much, we've gone from darkness to light as far as the federal administration, but many states still operate like this. Hey, look, there's many in the federal government, even, Republicans that they ought to be really Democrats because of the positions they hold. But again, be that as it may, we're talking moral issues work themselves in through politics down to the living level of everybody in a country. And it was the same in Judah, and it's no different in the United States. So Isaiah 5 provides a perfect example of the application of how Satan will pervert that which God gives for health and blessing, right? Under Moses' law, the Jews were instructed regarding each area that they failed in regard to these woes. There is no reason to fail, or there was no reason to fail, but they allowed Satan's perversion of the things God provided, and it ruined their society and resulted in judgment. The bottom line is this: Satan will pervert everything. There is nothing he ignores. He doesn't let anything go. Nothing gets by. He perverts responsible authority into oppressive despotism. He perverts agape love into self-serving disregard for others. He perverts the rule of law into mob rule by violence. He perverts God's image in human value into evolutionary random mistakes that remove purpose and dignity. He perverts God's creation of distinct genders, which is biology, into gender confusion for aberrant sexual gratification, which is paganism. That's really what we've gone back to with all this. He perverts voluntary submission into abject slavery. and he perverts beautiful reliance on God for strength and comfort into ugly independence from God, from which all other iniquities inevitably result. You know his followers because they imitate their master and Lord. So we'll talk about imitation next time. And the next one is Satan is an imitator. So this one is a little shorter, thank God. But anyways, until next time, hopefully this is helping you understand how Satan does what he does. I would still recommend you get that book by Dwight Pentecost, Your Adversary the Devil. And until next time, may God richly bless you as you continue to study his word.